I wasn't able to read steadily for the last several years because of adult life and probably ADHD, but early 2022 I downloaded the Libby app where I've been able to listen to tons of audiobooks from my library. So I read 113 books in 1 year for the first time probably ever. I am including a couple picture books, short story collections, novellas, but most of it's novels. I'm not touching on manga because that's a whole other ballgame, but I wanted to talk about everything I've read. So, I'm just gonna start from the top of the list and go through the rest of the year. Five Wounds by Kirsten Valdez Quaid. A solid domestic drama about three generations of a Latin American family. It depicts the struggles of poverty, growing up, and depending on family while not being able to depend on them. Number two, One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston? I'm not sure. I mostly read it for the butch lead, but it's a fun soft romance with a supernatural angle I didn't know was coming. It's a fun read. Dope Sick by Beth Macy, a nonfiction book about the opioid crisis in the US. If this doesn't make you angry about the American healthcare system, nothing will. I can no longer watch Gus on Psych the same way because I'm so mad that he's a pharmaceutical sales representative. It is a very important read to me. The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. This is the first of many mystery thrillers on the list. It's a book by and for murderinos. Literally, the dedication says so. And the main character really embodies that. It switches perspectives from this woman in the present trying to solve a mystery and her aunt in the past who had mysteriously died. I love nonlinear storytelling and perspective switches, so it was a good read for me. My one nitpick about the book is it's so trust your gut that the main character doesn't care about obvious red flags of a love interest who is 10 years older than her with a mysterious past, and she's just totally trusting him, even in a scene where she's unironically reading The Stranger Beside Me, and there's just no awareness about that moment whatsoever. Just a PSA, you can't always trust your gut. Your gut can be racist. Your gut can trust a guy just because he's white or he's nice to you. You have to take a step back and look at things objectively. Like, that's mostly a nitpick about me, but I like the actual mystery of the book, especially the flashback scenes. A Porcupine Named Fluffy by Helen Lester, a book about nominative determinism and the rejection of prescribed identity. It is a picture book about a talking porcupine who wears overalls from when I was a kid. Defending Jacob by Willem Landay. No, I have not seen the series with Chris Evans that this is based on. From what I remember, I think the kid in that was too young anyway. But it's a thriller about a prosecutor whose teenage son is accused of first-degree murder. It's an interesting perspective for someone very familiar with prosecution to find themselves in the defensive end of that. And I read this book shortly after listening to the trial portion of the podcast The Dropout about Elizabeth Holmes, and I noticed it was really accurate on court proceedings, and it turns out, yeah, the author used to be a prosecutor. He was drawing on his real-life experiences. The narrator, the narrator is pretty unlikable, but it does slowly become clear that that's incredibly intentional on the author's part. Next one is I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, a true crime book about the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer active in California from 1974 to 1986. The crime was unsolved at the publishing of the book, but there's a docuseries of the same name on HBO Max, which follows up with the eventual capture, sadly without the late author present. The book is very well written and gets first-hand accounts from some of the many victims, several of whom appear in the documentary. The number of aliases given to just one person, as in like the Visalia ransacker, the original Night Stalker, the East Area rapist, all of those being the same person, it's mind-boggling that anyone was able to connect all of those things, and it feels so complicated. Even though it was just one person. But the fact that the guy turned out to be a cop explains a lot about how he went uncaught for so long. Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered by Georgia Hardstark and Karen Kilgariff. This one I actually have a physical copy of. I got it for $5 at the grocery store, but I did originally listen to it on audio, which I highly recommend because the hosts and readers are podcasters. It's a funny dual memoir slash autobiography about the host of My Favorite Murder. That podcast is a guilty pleasure of mine, and the book is an easy way to try memoirs if you're curious about them as a medium. It's got light, humorous moments and then goes into more personal traumas the authors went through and are still affected by, but in a way that makes you feel less alone in your anxieties. The audiobook also features Paul Giamatti. The House on Trad Street by Karen White. This book disappointed me because the premise is a realtor who can see ghosts, and I love haunted house stories. That's just such a good, fun, juicy idea. My main problems came at the end, where I still didn't care for the romance between the bickering leads. They're in the South, but there's seemingly no black characters, and on top of that, we're supposed to sympathize with certain characters who refer to the Civil War as the war between the states, or even the war of northern aggression. The mystery also slogs at the end because it obsesses over codexes and word puzzles when we really don't need those to figure out where the hidden treasure is buried at that point, and maybe it's better in written form, but it was just awful to get through by the end of that. It just did not need to be 13 hours long. Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. This was my first Gillian Flynn novel, and it completely lived up to the hype. It was shocking, dramatic, vulnerable. It was a perfect thriller. The Grown-Up by Gillian Flynn. A short story more on the comedic side, but still a thriller. A good ambiguous ending, but I wish I knew for sure that no one heard the cat. Deja Dead by Kathy Reichs. The first book in the series, the TV show Bones is based on. I didn't expect the lead to be from Quebec of all places, given the show, or to be a single mom with a young adult. But it was a decent murder mystery. I won't read the sequels, but if you didn't like the show, the books will be different for sure. I Am a Bunny by Richard Scarry. Is there anything more peaceful or beautiful than I Am a Bunny? I've stared at these pictures for hours since I was a kid. If I could have them muraled on my walls, I would. It is simple and hypnotic and perfect. I wish I could be as serene as this book makes me feel. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Apparently the copy my library read was abridged, but I found it tedious and seemingly pro-book burning, although I've heard the author was just anti-Knight's Tales and not anti-book. We are completely beside ourselves. Aside from warning you about animal cruelty, I think it's best to go into this one completely plot blind. It's a period piece and a family drama, and it's good at depicting our memories and past understandings from childhood versus what actually happened or what others think happened. It's got a lot of emotion and can be hard to get through some of those bits at times, but it's a very compelling story. Christine by Stephen King. My first Stephen King book. Longer than I'm used to, but I'd fully recommend the audiobook since the reader is very good at changing their voice gradually as the protagonist. He becomes slowly more haunted, and the voice varies just little by little in a way you almost don't notice. The book itself is creepy and well written, but I'm too aware of horror tropes decades after it was written for some of it to really hit. The Guest List by Lucy Foley. Perfect whodunit before the whodunit even happens. It keeps you on your toes right up until the last minute. Nobody gets murdered at the beginning, but you're fully expecting a murder, and you can kind of figure out who it's going to be quickly, but you still don't know who's going to do the killing. It's full of anger and suspicion and shifting perspectives between different wedding guests. If you like murder mysteries, you need to read it immediately. Never Have I Ever by Jocelyn Jackson. It's a domestic thriller about a woman whose past is threatening to come out. There's genuinely shocking twists, but the final one honestly feels like a makes it easy moment for the protagonist. For the most part, it's a good read. Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Excellent horror novel. Its biggest source of horror for me, aside from the rats, is the powerlessness the women in the book can come up against when challenged by men, or in one character's case, by the rich white community. And that vulnerability is well illustrated, as well as their need to overcome it for themselves and others. Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney. Another book that switches in time, with every other chapter being from a childhood diary, and the other half being the present thoughts of the main character as she's in a coma. I love its twists and turns. It has a last minute, or is it, kind of ending that feels tacked on, but I just ignore that, and the rest of it's excellent. The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. Point of view switches between a woman's therapist and herself before she started to refuse to speak, and he's trying to figure out why. I love all the twists and turns, and I found it really satisfying. My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. An even more 1980s book than the vampire slaving novel, this book solidified to me that Hendrix has a talent for writing strong female relationships. Some of the horror gets nasty, but it's ultimately a story about the power of platonic love. Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. Domestic drama about a family mourning the recent death of the middle child of the family and their struggles with mid-century racism and sexism. It's a solid and emotional story. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. After reading a bunch of contemporary novels, this was my first go at classic lit this year. It's another domestic drama about the life of a woman and the 3 husbands she has throughout her life. The main character struggles with life as a Black woman in the 1930s, with little control over her relationships, with a more freeing relationship in her 3rd marriage. It is a beautiful, heartfelt story about a woman's loss, joy, and her search for true love in her life. One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. I love a locked door mystery, so I was thrilled with this book's premise and conclusion. The romance was okay, but overall the characters were fun and I loved the mystery. If You Were Here by Alafair Burke. A woman thinks she sees a friend who went missing 10 years ago. It's a solid thriller. As I cover more thrillers, I'm not going to have as much to say about some of them. Before the Fall by Noah Hawley. A story about a small plane crash with only 2 survivors, a 4-year-old and the man who saved him from drowning. The book switches between a few different characters in the present and 1 chapter for each passenger who didn't survive the crash. While there is a mystery of what caused the crash, the book is largely about grief, trauma, and understanding those things. Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. It's a true crime story about the Elizabeth Holmes / Theranos scandal. I read this book after listening to both the Bad Blood and Dropout podcasts, and you'd think I'd be bored with the story by then, but I really wasn't. The story of the Theranos scam is fascinating to me, and the book holds up. My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. She's Nigerian. I should have looked that name up. This is a Nigerian novella about a woman who usually protects her sister when she kills her partners, but she finds herself struggling when her sister is flirting with someone she knows. It's a fun, quick read. Pretty Little Liars by Sarah Shepard. Bad. I know it's for teens in 2007, but half the lies the characters are hiding are that older men are preying on them, something that isn't their fault or something for them to be the bad guy for, but the other characters and maybe the writers seem to think it is. Because it's for a younger audience, it also just isn't long enough. The climax of the book is what should be the halfway point, but the drama never hooked me enough to make me want to pick up the second book. The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nai Vo. Surprisingly gripping for a short story. It's about the history of a royal family and her a royal woman and her family secrets. There is a sequel, but I'm waiting for my library to get it on audio before I check it out. The House by Raylan Drake. It's a haunted house short story. It might be fun for reading the kids around Halloween. Monster by Walter Dean Myers. I've never read a Walter Dean Myers I didn't like. I found it easier to read the script format in an audiobook than in print, but it's a vulnerable look at a young Black man caught in the criminal justice system. And by young Black man, I mean a teenager. Letter to My Daughter by Maya Angelou. This was my first Maya Angelou. It's a memoir with chapters for a hypothetical daughter Maya Angelou never had, with you as the reader being the daughter she wishes to impart wisdom to. Most of the stories are from Angelou's adult life and are truly fascinating as well as beautifully written. Darius and Twig by Walter Dean Myers. Another coming-of-age novel that's lighter than Monster, but nonetheless carries the emotional honesty of all Myers' work. The People Could Fly by Virginia Hamilton. A collection of African-American folk tales. I find folk tales interesting because they reflect the specific cultures they were made in and are the building blocks of modern stories that we've simply forgotten. I got to the section explaining Briar Rabbit and realized where Bugs Bunny came from. A lot of stories are funny or creepy or both. I noticed similar versions of stories in the horror compilations that I have farther down the list. I'd encourage anyone to look more into folktales, especially books like this, with author's note explaining the cultural context of each story. The Thief by Fuminori Nakamura. A crime novella about a pickpocket that I found pretty entertaining. I'm Not Dying With You Tonight by Gilly Segal and Kimberly Jones. I think I'm a little too old for this as a YA book, but I didn't get to read a lot of books about racial conflict from Black authors when I was a teenager, so it's not bad to read those now. It's a short story and it's very direct. I like that it doesn't end making the Black character and the white character best friends. They care about each other as human beings, but they don't need to care about each other intimately for their humanity to matter. The Banishment by M.C. Beaton. I usually hate period pieces that take place before the 60s, especially period romances, but this novella is about putting a rich snob in her place, and that I can get behind. The whole point of the book is that the rich family is out of their minds and has their priorities messed up, and that's the kind of perspective I'm into here. Mom and Me and Mom by Maya Angelou. Some of the stories in this overlap with Letters to My Daughter, but it offers plenty of new info, including detailing Angelou's career as a dancer. There's a warmth in how Angela talks about her mother and grandmother, and like all her books, she reads the audio herself, making it feel even more personal. Anansi the Spider by Gerald McDermott, and Arrow to the Sun by Gerald McDermott. Two picture books of folktales I like. All Adults Here by Emma Straub. A domestic drama that's honestly too low stakes. I kept wishing something stronger would happen, but even the family conflict is pretty low to mid-level. One of Us Is Next by Karen McManus. It's not nearly as good as the first One of Us Is Lying book, but there is a great twist right at the very end, but overall the story's just fine. The 100 Dresses by Eleanor Estes, a short story about being nice to the weird girl in your class. The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine by Mark Twain and Philip C. Stead. This is an interesting project where someone took notes from bedtime stories written by Mark Twain and decided to flesh them out as a full short story. It's quirky and nice. The Sleeper and the Spindle by Neil Gaiman. It's Neil Gaiman retelling Sleeping Beauty. It's exactly what you think. The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. It's a young adult novella about a Latina with a very strict Catholic mother and a detached father, and the leads struggle to find any freedom, control, or expression in her life. I highly recommend it. Imperfect Justice by Jeff Ashton. It's a true crime book telling the story of Casey Anthony, and it's written by one of her prosecutors. Because it's written by the prosecution, it's obviously biased, but honestly, Casey Anthony is the OJ of white women. The evidence is circumstantial, but egregious. The process of Anthony's behavior throughout the whole ordeal is wild, and I will not be watching the new documentary coming from her point of view. The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. I'm not much for sci-fi, so I thought a sci-fi domestic thriller would be a good starting place, and I was so extremely right. There's a scientist who finds out her husband has custom cloned her to his own preferences and married her clone instead. She has to keep it quiet for the sake of her career. This was an excellent read, made even better by the reader X.E. Sands, whose low voice makes the lead remind me of Elizabeth Holmes, which is perfect for her position and her job in the book. I highly recommend this. The Family by Jeff Charlotte. This book is dense. It's nonfiction, and there's not really a light way to explain the origins of prosperity gospel and how it contributed to American politics for the last century, but if you can parse through it, I find it an important read, especially if you've noticed or are interested in the rise of conservative Christianity in politics, like I am. Weirdly, the Netflix documentary was somehow more boring and confusing to me, but I only got through 2 episodes, so who knows how that goes out. American Tall Tales by Mary Pope Osborne. It's not as good as folk tales. Tall tales seem to specifically refer to stories about a person who is really cool, instead of just being a general story. Sally Ann Thunderant Whirlwind is a great roller derby name, though. Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas. I didn't know I wanted a Peter Pan thriller. I don't mean it's an edgelord retelling, it's just a good thriller that also happens to be based on Peter Pan, and I love Avi Roque as the reader. Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. I'd read other books by this author as a kid, but never this one. It's very charming, and I get why it's so loved. Stormfront by Jim Butcher. First book in the Dresden Files, a series someone at my old office was evangelical about, but I didn't read until a year and a half after leaving, and I'm glad for that because this book was terrible. The fairy character was hilarious, but they only show up once, and the dry humor of the narrator doesn't land. The protagonist has to comment on the appearance of every woman he encounters, and has a weird thing about nipples. The mystery is weak and seems to have sex shoehorned into it just because, and I don't mean sex scenes. I mean a couple having sex off-screen as part of a spell, and it's like, why did you mention this? Why did this need to be part of the spell? It's not even on screen, and they aren't people who are, like, in charge of this plot. The final climax, no pun intended, is also weak because people are like, wow, Harry Dresden, you really put yourself in danger to solve this mystery. But he was the next target of a serial killer, putting himself in danger like he was already in that danger, and it's completely self-serving to try to stop it. It didn't raise the stakes at all, and on top of that, the world building with the magic in this society is weak. Ugh. The Lantern Man by John Bassoff. It's a mountain gothic horror novel for anyone who loves unreliable narrators. It's written in the form of a journal letter left by a dead girl with footnotes from a detective wanting to reopen her case, showing the contradictions between the journal and reality while still leaving the possibility of a mysterious something going on. Uncomfortable Conversations with the Black Man by Emmanuel Acho. I was unsurprised to find out the essays in this book were written by a YouTuber. The tone is extremely conversational and accessible, and it's a good intro to racial politics because of that. You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Aweke Emezi. A romance read on audio by Bonnie Turpin, my favorite audio reader who's done a couple other books on this list, and she really brings this character home for me. A widow and a widower start to fall for each other, understanding that unique grief, but the widow is dating that man's son. The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. It's another horror book with ambiguous narrators, but this one is more intimate because it's someone annotating a memoir a friend wrote about her. There's a mutual sense of fear, closeness, and betrayal between the characters that's a fascinating read until the end. The Ways of the Dead by Neely Tucker. A journalist solving a murder mystery in Washington, D.C. It was good, but the sequels don't seem to follow up on the first story, so I probably won't read them. The Exorcist by William Blatty. I'd never seen the movie until this year when I read the book, and it's extremely accurate, due in no small part to the author writing the screenplay. I gotta say the archaeology stuff feels just as pointless in both versions, but otherwise the movie adds to a much-needed exorcism scene and cuts out parts with the detective character that were interesting to read, but would have taken too long in the movie. I loved the level of detail the book went into to explain all the things it could be besides a possession, and why the Catholic Church is skeptical of it. That's something that feels like it was there just for me, as someone who's interested in those things. I was actually shocked when I found out the book came out before the famous case of Anneliese Michel, because there were so many threads that they shared, but I guess that's just how well written it was. Too Bright to See by Kyle Lukoff. A juvenile fiction book about a kid seeming to be haunted by their late uncle while they're struggling with growing up and entering middle school. It's very queer. Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. While I didn't like it quite as much as Sharp Objects, this was a great murder mystery. It references the Satanic Panic a lot, a period of American history that's fascinating to me, with half of the book taking place in the 1980s during that panic and the other half in the early aughts when the book was written. It depicts the grossness of true crime fans pretty accurately without just writing them in to dump on them. There is a point to them. Some of them are more deep and they are very plot relevant. It contributes to the story in an interesting way, and I love the flashback and perspective changes. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. I read the complete set of the Scary Stories collection of urban legends, and the scariest one was about the dummy skinning someone. I don't remember reading these specific books as a kid, but I remember hearing variations of most of the stories in magazines or online, and they're still fascinating. Terrifying Taste of Short and Shivery, and the sequel, even more short and shivery, by Ronald D. Sensosi. It's horror folk tales from around the world listing the country of origin from each one. It's very fun. The Berenstain Bears and the Spooky Old Trees by the Berenstains. It's a nice Halloween picture book I used to have. The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. Yes, I read all the Grady Hendrix books this year. I only watched some of the slashers the characters in this book are based on, but it was still a good read for me. I love how the lead loves her pet plant and how each character reacts to trauma in completely different ways, especially with the main character obviously not coping well, even when her paranoia seems to be helping sometimes. It makes her both heroic and unwell, and she has this desire to be better, even though she has these little justifications to stay where she is. Crying is Like the Rain by Heather Hawk Feinberg. It's a picture book about feelings. 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. I read this after watching The Black Phone, and I liked the movie version better, but enjoyed a lot of these short stories. I was worried some of them would just end darkly for darkness' sake, but more than one was way less dark than I expected it to turn out. 10 by Gretchen McNeil. And then there were none story that made me honestly glad I'm reading less YA these days. Tales from Edgar Allan Poe, volumes 1 and 3. It's Edgar Allan Poe. They were good. The Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. I think with his reputation for horror, I wasn't expecting to love King's character-focused stories so much. This was as deep and human as any literature I've read this year, and it lived up to its reputation. Remember Me by Sophie Kinsella. A British woman in 2007 has lost 3 years of her memory, going from a dead-end life, barely getting by with her friends and her recently deceased father, but she wakes up and is married and stinking rich, but with fewer friends. I was surprised how the angle of the friends is equally important or more important than the romance in the book, but I'm really happy about it. It was a funny read for me as a millennial. The Cay by Theodore Taylor. I had a guess of where the book was going from the genre, but it was still sad. I can see why so many middle schools teach it. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Because I had read Angelou's 2 shorter memoirs first, I thought I knew how dark it was going to get, but because the whole memoir is about her childhood, everything that's sad is so much sadder, because it's happening to a powerless child. There's little joys in it, but as always, it's the beautiful writing that really pulls it together. The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. The description in my library copy was brief, so I assumed it was an X-Men type plot for some reason, but nope, it's a zombie apocalypse. I'm glad I didn't know that going in because I'm not partial to that genre, but this one I liked. I love how this one tells it's partially from an infected child who doesn't fully understand the world she lives in or what's going on with her because she's a child. One-Eyed Cat by Paula Fox. It's a nice coming-of-age novel. The Man and the Monster by Martha Elliott. A true crime novel about a woman who befriends a serial rapist and killer as she interviews him for her writing. I normally avoid anything that centers on the perspective of the famous killer, and only chose this one because the man in the book isn't very well known, and I don't feel the yuck of him having star power. It's interesting to see a woman who calls out her friend when he's being self-pitying, but isn't too put off by him. And while I think the author does lean a little too hard into the belief that his mental state is a mitigating factor for his crimes, in my opinion, if the guy realizes by his second kill that willpower alone won't stop him, he has the responsibility to turn himself in, no matter what's causing the situation, and he didn't. The guy clearly has a desire to be seen as a good person, which is why he's seeking the death penalty, and while I'm used to the perspective of that, there's a little bit of good in everyone thing, I'm more fascinated by the perspective that because of her shared humanity with him, the author was still able to connect with him, and that makes it feel like people are able to connect with anyone under the right circumstances or given the right people. American Demon by Daniel Stashower. Another true crime novel. I wouldn't have read this book if I knew how much it was going to be about prohibition. The blurb says it's about both the Cleveland torso killer and the detective who searched for him, but the first 3 hours of the book focus almost entirely on the detective's bootleg busting, and I'm like, Daniel, there is a torso killer! I am not going to care about this detective breaking up crimes that have been legal for 100 years by the time I'm reading this. It's like the author really wanted to just gush over this detective, but needed to pitch the book being about something different to get it published, especially when the author is so even-handed about the detective deciding to burn down a homeless encampment to try to catch the killer. If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. My first James Baldwin, an excellent domestic drama about a black couple where the woman is pregnant and her partner is in prison, likely wrongly accused of rape. I knew very little about the book going in, and it did not disappoint. The Luckiest Girl Alive by Jessica Knoll. You might have seen this as a Netflix movie now. I have not seen the movie. I don't think the book uses its foreshadowing as well as it could, especially in the first half, but the longer it goes, the better it gets. And I can more than sympathize with the main character's struggle through her trauma and her class issues while trying to reclaim her own power. Annihilation by Jeffrey Vandermeer. A short novel I guess I'd describe as environmental cosmic horror, with the lead's unique perspective on biology being the most important part of the book. When I found out why the book was called Annihilation, I got chills. Sadie by Courtney Summers. Okay, I loved how this audiobook was done. The book has every other chapter written in the form of a podcast, and those chapters are produced like an audio drama, complete with a full cast and background noises to make it sound like they're recording live interviews, with the other chapters being recorded normally because they're from a traditional first-person perspective. It is so cool. The story itself is a crime revenge tale that the podcaster is trying to solve the mystery of. All the Missing Girls by Megan Miranda. Frankly, not enough missing girls. There's only 2. The format is that each chapter is 2 weeks in the future, going backwards from day 15 to day 1. It reads no more interestingly than if it was read in normal order, especially because the flashbacks sections are also told in a normal order, from start to finish, instead of finish to start. I think it relied too much on that format as a hook, but I might have just liked it better if it was told normally because I already found it unsurprising and too conventional for what the format was supposed to be. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I think this counts as psychological horror a bit because it's about this little girl's descent into madness from the perspective of the people around her, but it's overall a tragic telling of the suffering of a young black girl who is in the most vulnerable position in American society. The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. I didn't like this much. It's mostly frustrating that the culty people explaining to this family that you have to kill one of your family members to save the world, they just aren't good at understanding that the family doesn't believe their beliefs or good at explaining their beliefs. I know that I've read too much about cults to know that there's better ways to do this, but it's still a bit frustrating how unaware the characters seem to be about what they're doing. There's a couple bits I do like at the end. Like, there's this exchange where one of the parents in the family asks what kind of god would make a family kill part of itself for the rest of the world in an apocalypse, and the only response is, the one we have. It's such a blunt line about the brutality of the kind of god more apocalyptic Christians, especially in the US, are obsessed with. Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. It's a very fun, semi-haunted house thriller that just gives you enough reason to think that it may or may not go supernatural at any moment. I found it really fun and satisfying despite the awkwardly written prologue. A Good Marriage by Stephen King. A good domestic horror novella from our boy, Stephen King. Well, he's my mom's boy, but still. Local Woman Missing by Mary Kubica. It's a domestic thriller that jumps you right into the danger. It gets exciting hard and fast. A woman and her young daughter went missing 10 years ago. The mother was found dead, but the daughter was never recovered. The story flashes between the mother before her disappearance and the family in the present after the daughter has recently reappeared. I don't like this one aspect of the twist ending, but the other parts are so juicy to me that it was worth the read. Dark Harvest by Norman Partridge. A Halloween novella that's very Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. A town with a culty ritual sends its teen boys out every Halloween to hunt and kill this jack-o'-lantern man. I kinda loved it. Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. I love haunted house stories, again, if you can't tell by now. So this was fun, although it wasn't my favorite of the genre. It's good for people with mommy issues. Elevation by Stephen King. Light-hearted short story about a guy trying to befriend his local lesbians in a conservative town. Firestarter by Stephen King. I saw the movie before reading the book, and it's an extremely loyal adaptation, but I wasn't a fan of how the book was even more racist about the Native American villain. There's literally a line where he says he never felt more like an Indian than when he was hunting this little white girl. Yikes. Just watch the movie with Drew Barrymore. Two Can Keep a Secret by Karen M. McManus. A fun young adult mystery. Just as a side note, there's this bit where a guy tells the narrator's twin that he had a twin who was absorbed into the womb. And the narrator is all like, yeah, people are always oversharing with my brother. And I promise you, people just say stuff like that to twins all the time. But for the rest of the book, it had some fun twists. Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. My favorite telling of And Then There Were None to date. All the cast members are an estranged family coming together for the grandmother's Halloween birthday party. The conclusion was so good that when I finished it, I went back and reread most of the chapters, which I never do. It is my and Alice Feeney's favorite Alice Feeney book. The Project by Courtney Summers. The cult descriptions in the book line up with what I've read about cults to a very uncomfortable degree, making it a very tense read. It bugs me that even when the protagonist is still distrustful of this cult and thinks of it as a cult that took her sister away, at no point she thinks that they could be lying about what she's been doing in the cult or where she is. I know she's young, but it makes her seem more dumb than like she's just being conned. And maybe it's her distrust of her sister herself that's making her believe them, but it feels really weird given her attitude towards the cult so far in that portion of the book. And it's a sympathetic look at people who fall into cults, and it's following a mystery of the sister who was in the cult and is now absent from it. It switches between her perspective upon first joining the cult and her sister's perspective trying to find her. The Girl I Used to Be by April Henry. Decent YA thriller about a girl solving her parents' murder. The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. While it didn't meet the very high bar of Foley's The Guest List, the book has a lot of twists. A woman goes to stay at her brother's apartment, only to find him missing when she gets there. I kept thinking we had solved everything, and then it would throw me for another loop. It was so good. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Not at all what I expected. It's about surviving a post-apocalypse. Was surprisingly hopeful with a very human feel to it. It's a beautiful story about connection and living beyond survival. The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warrener. A memoir of a former member of the fundamentalist Mormon cult led by Ervil LeBaron. The writer is the daughter of the church's other prophet, Joel, Ervil's brother, who Ervil had killed when the author was a baby. As a child in the church, Ruth feels an ongoing sense of powerlessness with the inability to escape or to maintain a normal life, as her mother keeps going back to the cult and her abusive husband, while Ruth is forced to help her raise her many siblings. I love first-hand survivor accounts, and this one is incredibly powerful. Breaking Free by Rachel Jeffs. This is a memoir of the daughter of a prophet from a completely different branch of Mormon fundamentalism. This one is the FLDS, or the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. You may have heard of the leader Warren Jeffs. So while Ruth's memoir focuses on her childhood, Ruth stayed with her cult through a good amount of her adult life, her church not having that schism that Ruth's church had with her father's murder. It's very hard hearing Rachel, who narrates the book herself, describe the sexual abuse that she experienced from her father, and the further she struggles through being an adult, she's frequently separated from her children and the rest of her family at the whims of her father, and they have no system for properly managing the tension within these pluralist families. The way that Rachel analyzes her father's choices from an insider perspective is valuable, and the strength she had to talk about her abuse, let alone leave the group, run by her own family, is amazing. We Are All the Same in the Dark. A thriller told first from the point of view of a cop and then a teenager, both of whom have a disability and are trying to solve missing persons cases. Velvet Was the Night by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. It's a very 1970s crime novel. I'd say it's led by likably unlikable protagonists. Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. A contemporary novel about racism as experienced by a Black Zillennial and the white allies in her life who want to desperately not be racist. While racism is an everyday occurrence for the Black lead, and her main worry is not knowing what she wants to do with her life and her finances as she's turning 26, the other point of view character, her boss, just can't handle not being openly approved of by her Black employee. Unless by Carol Shields, a 2000 novel about a feminist translator and author trying to figure out why her daughter has chosen homelessness and won't speak to her family. Someone We Know by Sherry LaPena. Domestic thriller about a local woman who turns up dead with suspicions growing around town. It's fine. 2 parts sugar, 1 part murder by Valerie Burns. I usually can't start cozy mystery books because there will be like a dozen of them, but this is a new series and I love the baking theme, so it was fun and easy. However, it is funny that the local sheriff is so incompetent that she relied on an old woman to solve all her crimes until the day she died. The main character is a little insane and that makes her really funny, so I will definitely read the sequel when it comes out. Hashtag English Mastiff Life. Cultish by Amanda Montell. I've already mentioned I like learning about cults, so obviously I loved this. It comes at cults from a linguistic perspective and also examines cult-adjacent or cult-ish subcultures. Legends and Lattes by Travis Baltree. This book is like a warm cookie. It is so tailored to me who can't get into high fantasy because of the snobby sounding descriptions and high-stakes world building, but it's a coffee shop romance with a butch orc, so I love it. Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. Again, I like haunted house stories and thrillers, but I was really disappointed that this book used one of the same plot twists as Riley Sager's Lock Every Door, and to lesser effect. I guess if you're really into Amityville Horror, which it openly references, then you might like it still, but just read Lock Every Door if you're not into it. And finally, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I fully agree that more Christmas stories need to be about hauntings and torturing the rich. I knew some of the lines from the adaptations of this book, but funny bits and dialogue are very Lemony Snicket-esque. They're very clever and fun, and there's a reason the book has held up over time. That's my list. I'm going to see if I can get another book in before the end of the year, but it's the holiday season, so maybe not. So I actually did get another book in before the end of the year. It was The Island by Adrian McKinty. It's a really exciting book that jumps right into the action. It's about a family that goes on a vacation in Australia and finds themselves on an island where a stepmother has to take care of her 2 stepkids who don't like her after they get into some danger and the father gets separated from them. It's extremely exciting and so tense. There's some really good tension just with things like dehydration and trying to find food as they're being hunted by the people in the one family, really, that live on this island. It's so exciting, and I loved it so much. All right, I think that's the last book I'm going to be able to read in the year. So if there's anything else you liked, if you had any questions, comments, if you want to ask about what kind of books that I'm reading next, or if you want to tell me what books I should read next, just leave a comment. Thank you. Bye.
Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card.